Beware your human heart. This is Diabolical Index coming to you live from the Nut House. It is June 4th in 2008, and this is where the pages of the uncanny reside. I'm Corey Dawson, as always, and I came across a couple of really interesting ones this time. They kind of both fall under the banner of fiction, and I think they kind of, there's a certain thing that says that current fiction can't have, they can't have a certain banner across them, or they can't have a certain flavor about them where they don't end up in science fiction or fantasy. For some reason, they hide out in the fiction areas, and you come across them and you read them and you realize there's a little bit of a level of science fiction or fantasy to them, or what they call magical realism or speculative fiction in there somewhere. And these are definitely two of those. And one of the writers is actually a very famous writer of comic books. So I thought it was interesting to find a book, and it's well, anyway, I'll get to that in a second. But first of all, I'm going to bring back a couple of notable births and deaths in literary history for today. I couldn't pass them by. Just recently, I've been thinking about doing the births and deaths a little bit more abbreviated than I have been in the past. It seems like I get so many involved, and by the time I get done, it's half an hour in. But they're always important. It seems like I've come across a bunch of important ones over the last little while, so it makes sense. It made sense then, but for the last non-entry, I thought it was kind of filler that wasn't needed, and we got right into the action, and it turns out that it really helped out a lot. It had a lot of input on that one. So, but in this case, I definitely didn't want to pass these two by because they're pretty important. First of all, Franz Kafka was born this month, early in the month. I used to do it by the day, and now I try to just keep it within the week that I'll be broadcasting, because sometimes there are more ones that overlap and some that have a little more importance than others. But I'm sure that anyone who's listened to this podcast have heard of the term Kafkaesque when referring to a story or a book. Franz Kafka had a lot of stories that were dark and foreboding. There was a lot of sense of paranoia, like with a bureaucracy or an impending doom from the crush of government or economics, different things like that, but still kind of packaged within the working man's sphere. In my opinion, I think his most famous story is The Metamorphosis, and you see it a lot in current kind of hip literary circles. They like to put things on T-shirts, titles and famous covers from books, and one of them that always shows up is this cockroach picture image from The Metamorphosis. The story's about a salesman who goes to sleep and wakes up as a cockroach, and it's I think it's supposed to symbolize kind of like the fears and the paranoia, a little bit of the frustrations of the working class during that time, being seen as almost like an untouchable or lower than an insect or a disease carrier, or things like that. He also wrote The Trial and The Penal Colony. So there's a lot of plight of the working man that's involved with Franz Kafka's work, but there's very few things that don't come up, especially when you're talking. I mean, there are certain things, and if you've ever seen it normally comes up for me. I normally hear it in film when they're talking about films, and I remember the Christopher Nolan movie Following, that had a Kafkaesque feel to it, except in that case it was sheerly from the paranoid point of view of someone being stalked throughout their life. So, but yeah, if you haven't seen that movie, definitely check it out. It's kind of one of the smaller titles, because he's had such gigantic blockbusters now that a small movie like Following kind of fell through the cracks. And I guess for that matter, you could probably put Memento in there. Although that's a little bit more glib and stylish, and it wouldn't really fall under the tone, I don't think. But definitely the meat and potatoes of paranoia. I think that Memento definitely goes to the top of that list quick. But not talking about movies. I always end up filtering down into movies somehow. But Yeah, Franz Kafka was born in June, so definitely that's a big name. And on the other side of the coin, the deaths in June, the one that popped out to me was O. Henry. O. Henry, the author of many short stories. There's actually awards and contests done in O. Henry's name. That was a pen name, of course. I can't remember. I think his name was William. Can't remember his real name, but O. Henry wrote one of. I think that if you're trying to write a short story, if you're trying to learn how the framework of a short story should work when it comes to interplay, things balancing on each other, affected by each other, just like the flow and the framework. I definitely think that O. Henry, you could do a lot worse, especially since, I mean, I would like to think that M. Night Shyamalan probably got a lot of his tricks from O. Henry's books. There's always a surprise ending. O. Henry was famous for it. And I think kind of the quintessential O. Henry story would have to be The Gift of the Magi. There are very few people who, or at least back in the day, weren't forced to read that story as part of the English curriculum. It's one of those turnabout stories that actually it doesn't have a sad ending. It's got a happy ending. I guess there's a little bit of bittersweet in there, but it definitely rounds out the story of the characters really well. Basically has to do with two characters who love each other dearly, and they try to do the best for one another, but they're both in dire straits, so they both make sacrifices, and it ends up being kind of ironic sacrifices towards one another, and it shows their love even more in a surprise ending. So definitely I recommend O. Henry. I would say that overall I kind of prefer sake, not the wine, the rice wine, but the H.H. Munro, Sake, the short story writer. I slightly prefer Sake just because there's a little bit more of a gallows humor that goes along with it, and O. Henry can be slightly sappy at times. And I don't know. Sometimes I think that he not necessarily put on airs, because it's kind of the reverse of that. Almost kind of tried to come off as the salt of the earth, and nothing to say that he wasn't, but it just kind of it was a little bit overbearing sometimes. And I prefer Sake because there's definitely the wink and the smirk as he twists the knife on those. But coolest thing about O. Henry there is that there is a pun-off challenge in Austin every year, or at least there were. And personally myself, it's been a dream for a while to go down there and see if I could hold my own against the punsters that come down for the Austin O. Henry Championship of the puns. But it's named after him, and I'm actually kind of curious to see how that came about, because I mean, of course, there's turnabout and there's chance and surprise endings in the stories. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess that makes sense when you're thinking of a pun is kind of like the legerdemain and the sleight of hand of the language. Unless, if you don't get what they call a groaner, you have to get people to really suffer some serious pain due to your puns. Otherwise, you don't get taken seriously for them. But anyway, tangent. O. Henry died in June. So there's the births and deaths in literary history for tonight. And let's see. The first book I wanted to tackle today, both of these books were incredibly swift, quick, nimble reads. Definitely a lot of fun in both cases. The first one was Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. And Blake Crouch was the writer of the Wayward Pines television show. And I think that in critical circles, and actually, now that I think about it, every name that I saw on the back of this book, I totally respect. Harlan Coben, Lee Child, Andy Weir, Joseph Feiner, Justin Cronin, especially, Tess Gerritsen, they all just rave about Blake Crouch's work. And in this case, Dark Matter, it ended up being such a surprising read. It reminded me of a lot of things. One of my favorite books of all time. I haven't gone over it here because it would probably, I would have to have an entire episode just on this one alone. And it's kind of a shame that it's fallen by the wayside, and I think that a lot of people kind of discounted it due to the movie adaptation that came out, starring Chevy Chase, Daryl Hannah, and Sam Neill, actually, in a really great role that kind of characterized what he would have been as James Bond. Sam Neill was actually up to play James Bond for a while there, I think around the time of Timothy Dalton. But the book, which the movie was made off of, was Memoirs of an Invisible Man. And it really greatly and really swiftly and with, I don't know, a lot of humor, but also with a lot of sinister peril, too, and risk and stakes, and class, too. Memoirs of an Invisible Man, H.F. Saint. This book really reminded me of that due to the kind of the everyday plight of someone in a really fantastical situation and an unbelievable set of circumstances that he had something to do with due to choices of his own and choices that weren't of his own. But in that book especially, and in this book, it has a kind of a Twilight Zone quality, kind of like a moral quality, a balance that's struck when you find out that what you may have wanted all along wasn't what you thought it was. Kind of like the be careful what you wish for type of thing. And that book, being invisible, is not at all what it's cracked up to be. There are a lot of pitfalls. There's a lot of promise, but there's a lot of pitfalls to being invisible. And in this case, in Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, it's basically a story of what could have been. Everyone kind of thinks about, how would my life be different if I had made certain choices along the way, if I had met this person, if I hadn't met this person, if I had taken this job, if I had given this job up. It's a very interesting, relatable story, actually. The protagonist, Jason, is a physics professor in a small little capacity, but you find out over time in the book that his promise was much, much greater. He was on the brink of some incredible discoveries in the time when he was in college, post-college, and he would have done great things. But, it's one of those, it explores whether or not certain choices that he made would have taken him in this direction, in a different direction, because he meets Daniela, basically an artist, soon to be am I coming through? Soon to be a great artist, but a relationship they get into starts to involve children and pregnancy. So they make the decision together to basically focus on their family, and they kind of pare down their accolades, and they put a stop to a lot of the ambition that they would have had. And that's where the kind of like the turn and the hook of the story comes in. Like I said, it's really relatable. In fact, Jason is my age, and right now, I'm coming into fatherhood and things like that, and a lot of the things that was going on made sense to me during the story as it went along. But there's kind of a wild card, a little bit of a dark horse in their circle of friends named Ryan, who is a winner of a very prestigious scientific award that's kind of made him a Tony Stark type, a rock star scientist, having made this leap into science, and it's ended up landing him fortune and fame, and kind of like this circling pack of vultures wanting to latch onto his name and his leaps in that field. And as it goes along, you realize that Ryan and Jason were kind of like these friends in college, and kind of like, they competed with each other for the affections of Daniela, and for the ventures into scientific inquiry and experimentation that would lead Ryan to these heights of fame and fortune, and that Jason had to leave behind in order to go on with his life and family. Can you move that to the side slightly?
What?
I'm missing a lot of these comments.
It all pops up here. That's just people coming in and out.
Well, but I'm seeing Suzanne Beam looks like, yeah. Dark Matter, yeah, definitely. When I picked it up, a lot of times when I go for these, and in fact, I'm thinking about opening up the podcast for requests. If anyone, and I'll put that out there right now. If anyone has any requests in the coming weeks for me to kind of like juxtapose books against each other, took a second for it to come up. It's up now. What's that now?
This is delayed.
Oh, I see.
I forgot to tell you.
That's all right. Yeah, Dark Matter. It was very, very surprising. I was actually kind of surprised I hadn't heard of it yet because it was just so swift. It's a larger book. I can't remember how many pages it was. It's up in the mid 300s. So I just tore through this book like nobody's business, and I think it's because everyone is so well fleshed out, and you wouldn't think that with the pace that it has, you wouldn't think they would have had the time for that, but it is a deft hand working, and it maybe has to do with the work with television because, and also I heard that Dark Matter is up for a movie. It's coming up soon, but it totally shows the whole thing all the way through. I could totally picture everyone. Everyone was totally fleshed out. The relationship, the family dynamic was totally fleshed out. And also, but the hook of the story is he goes to kind of like a strained barroom meeting of Ryan and his hangers-on, and Ryan always seems to kind of be. He almost mourns Jason's lack of ambition, or not necessarily lack of ambition, but almost like a denial or abandonment of his ambition. And it's hard to tell if he taunts him with it or if it's just sort of a playful remembrances and, what could have been. So he goes to the bar to meet him, and he leaves slightly buzzed to go home. And it's actually one of his haunts near his home. So he leaves a dinner with his wife and child, or it's a dinner that's coming up, and he goes to walk home, and he is set upon by a kidnapper, and the kidnapper is wearing a geisha mask. It's actually really terrifying because in its simplicity, it's so relatable. This could totally happen to anyone. But he's taken at gunpoint and driven away from his home and his neighborhood by an unknown assailant, and there are no answers. But as they go along, you realize that this isn't just some random robber or kidnapper or blackmailer. You know that it's much, much more than that. Mostly from the almost stilted hatred that the captor puts out towards Jason, as if he's wronged him in some sort of way. And as it goes along, he forces Jason to drive him to a warehouse where he is injected and drugged. And as it goes along, it's difficult. I don't want to give way too much, but basically, the whole book, the axis of the entire book, is the idea of other you. The whole idea where there is a vast multiverse, and it's weird to bring that up. Because the whole story really sounds, commonplace. It sounds like anything you would see in maybe even like a romantic comedy or just like a drama with maybe a little bit of thriller rolled in. But then the idea of alternate versions of yourself, alternate universes that exist, and are under us, around us, through us, all at all times. And basically, he is drugged and beaten by this captor, and finds himself in a warehouse surrounded by EMT personnel and people he hasn't ever met in his life, and he's whisked away, and he's totally sore from being beaten. He's totally disoriented from the drugging and from the capture, and he comes to realize that he is no longer in his sphere. He's no longer in his neighborhood or his life, for that matter. And it turns out that there are many more things afoot than he ever could have realized, and they all kind of spin off the orbit of his former potentialities. So it all kind of it's difficult to go into. I was telling Andrew earlier that it's difficult to go into it. The idea of quantum superposition, and the whole the explanation of Schrodinger's cat, and how observance and how just watching something can cause it to come into being or cease to be, or it might change the outcome of a situation when it comes that like down to the in microcosm, or in quantum field studies, things like that. Things can change if you're watching them. It's kind of it's a very, very interesting thing to think about. But he finds allies, some that he's known, some that he's never met. This man Leighton Vance, probably, if you're going to meet a person in a story like this and their name is Leighton Vance, Leighton Vance, chances are they're not going to be a nice person. It's just one of those wonderful, not to say that the guy's necessarily a villain, because he's kind of a corporate type, but most definitely ruthless, because the potential and the absolute, just the applications of what he, Jason, has created due to the intervention of Ryan in one aspect, and his own, the kind of like the thwarted dreams that he had ends up bearing fruit in this new place that he finds him in, and due to that, there ends up I don't want to give away too much, because it's such a rollicking adventure inside of this completely emotional, the emotional movement of the family. And at one point he's taken away, during his captivity, he is completely taken away from his family, and then he discovers that there are some places where this family never existed, because he went on to do these things. But still, at the same time, he sees these people as what they became after not doing the things that he knows them to have done. So it's totally fantastic. I totally recommend Dark Matter, and Suzanne obviously agrees with me, and she's gotten into it way before I did. But when I go to when I search around for books that I can kind of put up against one another for one reason or another, I never know what I'm going to get into, and I almost always end up finding connections between both of them. Sorry, getting into that. I think one of the most startling things about Dark Matter, though, is there are all kinds of scenes that I would love to read verbatim and just go through the entire scenes with everybody so they would get it. But at the same time, I would kind of like everybody to experience it firsthand for themselves because I just I know I've said it before. I'll say it again. I can't get over how quickly it moved. The pacing is crazy, and I think that it might be one of the things of being a writer for television, where you're able to put in such a setup that you can see the characters moving through the space. You can imagine what it'd be like to see them on a screen, which I normally do as it is. But in this case, I mean, as far as I can tell, an entire third of the book has to do with his current family dynamic, and then the abduction and the things that happen in the warehouse. So I mean, that's a long time to take with that, but you never feel it. You're through it before it's such a suspenseful, meaningful, emotional ride that you even despite the really big heady ideas that happen in this book. I mean, at one point they are glimpsing a corridor, or what looks like a corridor, of infinite possibilities, entrances and exits. And they go into this thing. They go into this idea that they refer to as the box. There's this box that facilitates not necessarily just travel as much as it's kind of like a safe place for you to be aware of the multiverse. So at one point they're encased in this, and in order to glimpse the multiverse, you have to kind of nullify parts of your brain that would see it as illogical, or that aren't happening, just so you don't resist it. And they see this, what they call a corridor, and what it is just exactly where they are in that space, and that almost like a nexus between all of these multiversal possibilities, and it seems to extend off into forever, and they only have a limited amount of time of ability to observe this under this drug-induced clarity they have, and they end up going to a few potentialities that are terrifying. So it's basically got everything that you would ever want. It's got terror. It's got romance. It's got relatable family happenings, just normal things. It's got the growth of characters as people, as husband and wife. It's got the like Suzanne just said, the path not taken. It totally explores that, and what could be, what may have been, what shouldn't have been, all of those things, and brutal violence in some cases, but redemption, reclamation, betrayal. It's got everything. Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, definitely strong recommend. There's a lot more I could talk about it, but I think it would be much better if everyone went into it cold. Suzanne, The Terror. I would read anything Dan Simmons put out. And I have The Terror. To be honest, I mistakenly bought a large print edition of The Terror, and that's the only reason why I haven't read it yet. I dislike large print editions. It might come up that I'll need that to survive one day. I don't know what my eyes are going to be like. I think practically everyone in my family needs glasses but me, so it's probably destined, especially since I read so much, that it's going to happen. But so far, it's just because I'm not a gigantic fan of large print that I haven't read The Terror, but the story has always seemed like it would be completely engrossing and terrifying to me, and I've been avoiding the show as well. Although that does kind of go against my principle. I normally like to watch the adaptation before I read the book, and it's gotten me into a lot of debates and trouble about that, a lot of arguments. But to me, I think that watching an adaptation, especially on film or television, first allows you to kind of glimpse characters, kind of like avatars that you put over the characters in a book, situations, places, environments, different things like that, where you can kind of keep those in your mind. And then the book does nothing but expand those things, and sometimes refine them, sometimes even edit them. I think it's much better to do it that way because, in my opinion, like I said, I've gotten into a lot of arguments about this before. In my opinion, if you do it the other way around, then seeing the movie afterwards can only shrink and diminish any sort of scope that the book would have had. Whereas in the other direction, the book would only enhance it through the power of your own imagination. So there you go. No, so to answer your question, no, I have not seen the Terror television series, but my God, if there was ever a story, I mean, from what, like I said, from what I've seen or from what I've read off the back and different things, it seems like that was born to be a television series. And I'm a big fan of Arctic. If I'm remembering it correctly, I think it happens in like an Arctic climate. I love me some Arctic terror stories. I love them. There's something about it, even back as far as At the Mountains of Madness. There's nothing like it. And the Thing films, Howard Hawks film, and the John Carpenter version. I haven't seen 30 Days a Night, so I can't put that up to that. But basically, any horror that happens in an Arctic climate, I am a gigantic fan of. So there you go, The Terror. It's probably wonderful, and like I said, Dan Simmons, one of my big favorites. So I need to check it out.
Godfather rated us on Mixer.
What's that now?
A whole bunch of viewers over to us. That's why we have.
Oh, rock on.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So the second one on the docket is called Normal by Warren Ellis. And Warren Ellis is like I was saying before, I almost went into it then, a pretty famous kind of outlaw comic book writer. I won't lie, I get Grant Morrison, Alan Moore, and Warren Ellis mixed up pretty much on a weekly basis. I usually have to remember that Alan Moore is he's kind of like the dark elf wizard of the three. But the strange part is that Grant Morrison is actually kind of like his more stylish, I don't know if he's into Thelma or what, kind of like the Golden Dawn type of stuff. But he's also, as far as I know, I think that Grant Morrison is also a witch. So I get those two mixed up all the time. But basically, Warren Ellis wrote basically some of the most notable comic stories and series that have existed probably in the last 20 or 30 years or so. Did a wonderful kind of like send-up of the Fantastic Four and some basically not necessarily much more famous characters from the big two in comics, but basically kind of like send-ups of those called Planetary. And that's totally wonderful. A lot of pot shots at established tropes in comics, and he wrote Red, the fantastic comic that became the Fantastic movie with Bruce Willis in it, about the not necessarily elderly but past his prime agent that gets thrown back into the mix again. Transmetropolitan, I think that's the one. The Transmetropolitan? Yes, Transmetropolitan. So with Spider involved. I never really I never got the hang of Transmetropolitan, but definitely like Warren Ellis. And in this book, it brings a smile to my face. It basically I was explaining it to someone earlier today. I love me some Chuck Palahniuk. However, with him, it's kind of not necessarily you've seen them all type of thing, but there is kind of a one trick that Chuck has, and it goes into the multi-layered subplotting and I guess, kind of like gymnastics of language and this tremendous grasp of urban legend and mixing all of those things in at once. I mean, granted, definitely, I would put Choke up to practically any fiction book out there in the modern times, but there's definitely a awareness of the cleverness that comes through, and sometimes that can get a little bit tiring when you read something from someone that knows damn well that everyone is a zinger and this is going to be fantastic and this is going to be shocking and oh boy, look how clever I am. Not that I dislike Chuck Palahniuk. He's actually been going through a tough time. He was the victim of some embezzlement from his staff, so he's been in some dire straits as of late. But also talk about book to movie comparison and translation adaptation. Fight Club easily is probably one of the most seamless book to movie translations or adaptations I've ever seen. But anyway, enough about Chuck Palahniuk. But basically, this is what I was telling someone earlier was Normal by Warren Ellis. It reminds me of Chuck Palahniuk if you weren't quite aware of how clever you were and you were having a lot of fun doing it and allowing the other person to have fun with you without such a lofty opinion of yourself. In fact, I think I'm gonna read part of the first paragraph just so you can see what I mean. In my opinion, book lives or dies by its first paragraph. So, Normal by Warren Ellis, first paragraph. Hand over the entire internet now and nobody gets hurt, she said, aiming the toothbrush at the nurse like an evil magic wand. The end of the toothbrush had been inexpertly whittled into what someone who had only heard of a shank would think a shank would look like. Her hair was wire brush gray, secured at the back of with old brown rubber bands, and the left eye was twitching, enough that she occasionally pointed the supposed weapon at a ghost image over the nurse's shoulder. So that kind of gives you an idea of how this is going to begin. Basically, Normal is a wonderful title because it deals with the place, Normal Station, which became Normal, I think it was like Normal Point, Normal Hospital, Normal Head. It's called Normal Head. And it was a kind of like a manufactured town by someone trying to stake a claim long ago, who ends up going insane. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with the place, although that kind of lingers in the background about whether or not that's true. But basically, it takes place in a time that absolutely could be now, maybe a couple minutes forward in time, where there are two types of futurists and like philosophers and kind of like forecasters that try to perceive what's going to happen in the near future and try to thwart it through different ideas in science, economics, public planning, PR, even stuff like that. But the foresight strategists are those that work for charity organizations and benevolent groups that are trying to improve the earth and make sure that we avoid this doom and somehow, keep our standing on earth as well as it could have been. And the other ones are the strategic forecasters. They work for corporations who are trying to capitalize on different trends that are happening towards doom. And like Xander Drax said in the Phantom film, capitalizing or opportunity in chaos. So those are the two types of futurists that are doing what they call gazing into the abyss. And Nietzsche, he always says that the abyss gaze back into you. So that's what's happened here. That's what Normal Head is all about. Normal Head is a hospital for these futurists, these strategic forecasters that have gazed too far into the abyss and they end up going insane. So it reminds me so much of I guess it might also be because of the playfulness of the prose that's involved. It reminds me a lot of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because everyone you're speaking to is crazy, especially one of the what they call pre-staging events is that they sit you down with an inmate that's kind of like a veteran, and you get settled in by talking to them. And basically, Normal Head, like I said, normal, and especially Normal Head, there's so many connotations to it. By going to this place, they have disconnected you from your means of extrapolating the future. So, no phones, no internet, and nothing that would connect to Wi-Fi in any sort of way, or 3G, 4G data. And they actually they kind of weigh the options and give you psychological testing and evaluation before you're even allowed to borrow a book from the Normal Head library. So it's a cleansing, it's a detoxification program from these extrapolated views of the future. Every branch that would grow out of your head that would link you to possibilities down the line, or they're totally erased while you're here. And this is a very, very thin book, 140 some, almost 150, 148 pages. So it's very rare, especially now, that you see a book that comes out with so much packed into such a small distance between the covers. Usually when you see books coming out, even in the supernatural romance category, which luckily is kind of starting to die away, they're usually doorstops. I mean, 300 plus at least. I mean, how many different ways can you spin a werewolf slash vampire slash elf, or fae, as they like to go into it? You can only mix up so many fads at one time. But that's just my opinion. But kind of like the thing that turns everything on its head, even though the lead character, Adam, ends up at a table with, I think her name is Leela, and she, it's so interesting the way everything is described. He said that she has cold eyes, but a very, very incredibly winning smile. So it's really strange to think of this kind of like bisected face where the eyes are cold like a camera lens, but at the same time you have this gigantically wide smile. It would be a terrifying thing to see. But as he sits there talking to her, and she kind of runs down what it's like. In fact, there's even a demarcation aisle in between the corporate futurists and the benign, or the beneficial futurists, even in the cafeteria area, in the patio area. So they don't let them mix. And he notices that there's a really creepy big guy in a black coat that's just kind of like winding his way through the forest behind the outer tables area. And they say he's a new arrival, and he has this pang. It's so relatable. It's so personal. He has this pang, even though he's a futurist and he deals with all these technological marvels in order to extrapolate the future. He falls into this old pattern of almost like on a kindergarten schoolyard, where the guy in the forest, even though he's scary looking and he stays away from everyone, he's wearing a dark coat, he wants to meet with this person and link up because they're both new there. They're the newbies at Normal Head. And everyone's taken by force. You don't... You're forcibly committed to go to Normal Head by a nurse that he says could circumcise a redwood with his teeth. So This guy is a massive, mass mountain of a man, and he's just pulled out of his life and thrown into this hospital. And then something very, very strange happens. So in comes this strange thread of the locked room mystery, where this place where there are no cameras, there are no monitors, there are no invasions of privacy of any kind. You can actually, as an inmate, what they call an inmate there, you can actually lock the door behind you and keep your key inside with you to ensure that you're not invaded. So, of course, the guards get pissed when they find a room that's locked from the outside, and they go to find the guy in the dark coat, whose room it is. And when they open the door, there's no one there. And not only is there no human there, in the space where there would have been a human is a gigantic, frothing, skittering pile of bugs where this person would have been. And that's where it gets really, really, really interesting, because at one point Adam gets bent out of shape and he crushes one of these bugs. And what he discovers when he crushes the bugs upends the entire environment. I'm not going to tell you what it is, because I like surprises. Hopefully, so do you. And I mean, for real, this isn't even 150 pages. This is almost smaller than anything you would get at a Scholastic book fair at this point. So, especially with the wonderful dialogue and description and the cast of characters in this book. One's named, I don't know if it's supposed to be Clo or Clough. It's Clough. English accented, just kind of like a rabble rouser. He just walks around just kind of like heckling people and talking about the establishment. And Leela, he walks over Clo or Clough. I'm going to say Clo. Clo walks over to Adam and kind of whispers in his ear and says, have you noticed that whenever you start talking about food, Leela, she gets a little bit of slobber at the side of her mouth, and Leela gets pissed and tries to crush a cup and throw it at him, but it doesn't quite work because everything there is made to be non-threatening. The mold-injected chairs are all rounded off, but he basically tells Adam that she was sent there for eating someone at one point. So the best part is that he's not lackadaisical. He has this playful nihilism about being surrounded by probably the smartest group of absolute lunatics that could possibly exist, and then they end up finding this guy that somehow escapes this inescapable room. And does he become this pile of bugs? It points towards no once you find out what the bugs are, but it turns out that when they do find it out, it's an affront to everything that's going on there, and it sends this shockwave of paranoia and outrage and this strange kind of like, not necessarily a kangaroo court in microcosm or whatever, but it's fantastic. Both of these books were so surprising. And actually, you know what's funny? I just realized they put science fiction on this dark matter on the library copy. They put it in science fiction, so that's something. But see, I'm not so sure that works either. I think that it kind of skirts the line between those two things, because to say that science fiction is right, I mean, it definitely has aspects of science that are at the core of the story, but at the same time, it's such a non-classifiable work of art that it's for me, it's difficult to lump it. I mean, but I'm the type that I'm not a gigantic fan of books that say a such and such novel. I think that when you kind of, or like like if only one book has come out by this author, but it says #1 in a 3-part trilogy. I'm not a gigantic fan of that. It seems like even though it has a large scope, it almost like ropes you into this commitment with that. In fact, in the shop, in order to make sure that an entire series goes out at once, I have to bind it together because people are constantly looking for the 2nd and 4th parts and all that type of thing. So, to me, I think that kind of takes away from it when there's this expectation of a sequel. And actually, that's kind of a thing that is, I think that lends credence to kind of like the theory of people getting fatigue, like superhero fatigue and Star Wars fatigue right now, because we have one coming out not even every year. Like now it's almost like twice a year now. So when you expect more, when you know that multiples are in the offing, sometimes you might pay less attention. And even that with science fiction, if something can be classified that easily, for me, that takes a lot of the bite out of it a lot of times. But in this case, I mean, I guess it makes sense, and I guess it plays towards understanding by putting it in science fiction. That way, when you start reading it, you realize why it was there. But at the same time, all of these reviews from these authors, they don't say science, they say thriller. So, I guess that's kind of that. If it's so difficult for even other authors of that sort of stuff to classify it into science fiction or anything like that, I think that just speaks to it. I think that enhances it when you can't very, very neatly or easily put in any kind of any sort of, I mean, to use the hackneyed, box, when you can't put it in any sort of box, I think is really helpful. And putting normal in any sort of box, I think, is difficult too. And I would be really surprised if someone didn't, like, they're comparing him to a mixture of William Gibson and Margaret Atwood. I completely disagree. I don't see. In fact, I think that I would substitute Neil Stephenson instead of Gibson. Gibson's purview, I mean, by its very nature, at this point, is obsolete. I think that Neil Stephenson is much more of a bleeding edge type. But I mean, there is that cyber. I mean, there's always this hint of cyber. So I guess no, I'm not going to agree with William Gibson on that one. I'll definitely say Neil Stephenson, and actually Noah, my friend and compatriot for years, best friend. He would disagree with me. I'm not so sure he likes Neil Stephenson at all, but I love me some Snow Crash. I guess that it's because for me, William Gibson, there's a chunk of time that William Gibson's work falls into, and it's so of its time that it's difficult, even though it paved the way for everything that came after it. There's something about an iconoclast. There's something about when you've reached such a peak, it's difficult to see it as anything but a beginning. It's difficult to take it into context now. Just like you watch the Lawnmower Man, or the Lawnmower Man, or what's another, like Johnny Mnemonic, and I guess that's by relation, William Gibson thing. But it's so of its time that it's difficult to bring that out here. Oh, maybe I was wrong about that. I was under the impression, because Neil Stephenson was in his bookcase, I thought it was by accident. I thought someone had lent him Snow Crash, and I was under the impression he hated it with a passion. But there might be a question mark here. Noah's chiming in and saying disagree, question mark. So, with any luck, maybe he tried it out, maybe he dug it. We've had a lot of mutual book loves over the years, so maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe I got the wrong impression. I was barking up the wrong tree. I definitely know what we agree about. I may have been wrong about that. So if I jumped the gun, I was wrong about that, I apologize. So, I mean, as far as I can tell, if I'm wrong about anyone disliking Neil Stephenson, I'm totally happy with that mistake, because I think he's awesome. But to answer your question, Suzanne, I review books twice a month.
Every other week, yeah.
Yeah, every other week. So, yeah, I guess every other week is a better explanation for that. I started out with doing the. Well, I hope I'm usually right. I don't know. I think that. But this is back to Noah's point. I try to be a good judge of what I think someone else will like, and what I like. I mean, isn't that the case of everything, though? You like things, and you want other people to like things. You want them to appreciate what you like, so you can talk about mutual things. But at the same time, you also want to be able to find things that you think that they're gonna like. So that both comes in there. But yeah, I try to find two books without a whole lot of planning, if I can, that kind of play off one another. In this case, it was the idea of disappearance, the idea of perception of these two, and they ended up being alike, but as far away from one another as could possibly be. So this one was actually, I think it was definitely a victory. I found a couple of these, but in answer to what's next, on the second and the fourth week, is that the way it plays? It may not play out like a second and the fourth week, but basically from the first week, the first Monday that I did this, I did the two books, and then the next week after that, I ended up doing a live playthrough, I guess you call it. I don't know, a mutual live choose your own adventure. What's that now?
The most votes we take.
Yeah, and also so it's a totally interactive choose your own adventure game where I go through the books and I put the choices out there, and then according to what everyone votes on the comments on Magic Scroll Network for the Diabolical Index, I call those non-entry episodes. The entries that I do that end up going to the audio are only the reviews of the books that I've kind of like juxtaposed, because there are so many comments and there's so much conversation that doesn't get seen or heard on the non-entries, that they don't end up going onto Stitcher and Google Play and iTunes and Anchor and all the other stuff that we do. Does it end up on Anchor? The non-entry?
We're getting rid of the SoundCloud.
Okay, so we're...
It does the same thing as SoundCloud.
Yeah, we're getting rid of SoundCloud, so we're going to Anchor FM. But
then you can have your own webpage.
Yeah, so it's a little more individualized. But the non-entries, which is to say the Choose Your Own Adventures, don't end up there. But all that being said, to answer your question about what's next, I was actually giving some thought to maybe taking requests for two books to kind of pit against each other for the next one. Normally what I do is during the week of the non-entry, I kind of leisurely go into a library or into my own collection, and I try to find... but the thing about... I hesitate to say find. I almost like to say look around for things to kind of like jump out at me, because I don't really search that hard. I like it that way, because then it almost seems like more of a coincidental connections that I end up finding between the two books that I find. So yeah, so by that token, I haven't figured out what's going to be next in a couple of weeks. Or is it just 1 week? This week, and then, yeah. So a couple of weeks from now, I'm not exactly sure what they are. So if anyone has any suggestions for books that could kind of complement each other and go against one another and have connections and parallels as well as differences and maybe some opposite moves, I'm totally into all that. So feel free, anyone listening tonight or wherever, to send me requests or suggestions for books to do. I'm always trying to find new things with that. I'm not going to say that I'm going to take all the suggestions. I'm gonna weigh them against what I think might happen, only because I'm going to try to avoid, if I can, doing not necessarily obvious picks, but if something has just been talked about to death, I don't think that there may not be anything new that I can bring to it. So yeah. So anyone listening who wants to get involved and send me suggestions or picks that you have, you can do it here on the comment stream. You can email it to me at the Diabolical Index at columnist.com, or Paradox City Books and Games. You can hit me up on the messages there, or my personal page. And I'm Corey Dawson. I don't know. A lot of people didn't know that. I don't know. Who knows? I don't know. Once you see my face, it's hard to forget it. A lot of people will tell me that. I don't know. But yeah, Suzanne or anyone, if you have any ideas to that effect and things I can review. I mean, it's difficult to call these reviews. I don't know. Reviews are usually like, well, this is good because of this, and this is bad because of that, and it's kind of I would like to think that what I do is
Dissect it, maybe?
well, yeah. Sometimes I say the word dissect, but really, when it comes down to it, if I try to keep it at an hour and I'm doing 2 books, a half an hour, and then plus the births and deaths and other little plugs and different tangents I go off on, I don't go as in depth, only because really when it comes down to it, I'm trying not to spoil as much as I can, but give an impression and appreciation, and I don't know. I don't know. I have to think about that, because like I have used the term review in the past, but reviews are so final, and a lot of times with mine, it's very open-ended. It's a open-ended conversation with whoever's listening in. So I don't know, but that doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, you're having a good time, and so am I. So who cares? And also, I mean, you guys, I haven't had anyone call into question the fact that the one that I had read, actually has a different cover than the cover that he posted, and it doesn't have to do with anything other than I really prefer. I thought that the cover that I found the image for was totally awesome in comparison. I mean, this also makes sense in context of the book when you think about it, how it's doubling over on itself, and you see that things are being lost in the process, and it's becoming a little bit more abstract. I guess that makes sense too. But I love me some labyrinths, and the image of the dark matter that I put on. It's just all these labyrinths kind of like weaving into each other. And I'm up here now.
No, you're still there.
He points all over the place, and
No,
I
I
don't know.
wasn't pointing at all.
You were just stretching?
Yeah.
Because it's so strenuous. It's so strenuous doing the tech for the Diabolical Index. I put him through so many paces, he just doesn't know what to do. It's taxing. It's taxing. It taxes his everything to do it. But okay, so I'm trying to think of anything that I can put out there. I believe that next week I'm most likely going to do the R.L. Stine Twist-a-Plot. It was one of the ones that everybody voted on, and landslide totally blew Indiana Jones and the Eye of the Face totally blew that Twist-a-Plot out of the water. But I thought it'd be interesting to go after it, seeing as how it's R.L. Stine, and I'm curious as to see how he does with that sort of a thing. It's a little more of a sword of sorcery, but even then I haven't decided yet. I found a strange actual choose your own adventure, like the white and red covers, and the funny part is usually it came in these little pocket paperbacks, but for some reason this is this larger, thin hardback, and it's called "Help, You're Shrinking." So I thought that one might be pretty cool, kind of a little bit of a Honey I Shrunk the Kids type vibe, but it's difficult to judge the Choose Your Own Adventures because there was one Choose Your Own Adventure we did that was as tame could be, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I guess I'll be talking about this one till the day I die. But it was just so unexpected. These kids are running around looking at stuff, and all of a sudden, drive-by shooting. So I was like, whoa! And that made me kind of leery to discount the Choose Your Own Adventures, but at the same time, I guess that was the most boring one that we did. So it's hard to say with those. I like to kind of mix it up because I think that Choose Your Own Adventure has become a blanket term for all of those, and there are actually, during that time, there were a bunch of different brands of those. And sometimes they, like with the Indiana Jones thing, they ended up kind of like mixing it up with characters that existed in other media and all that kind of thing. And in fact, one of the books that I really remember my dad buying me at a little store in his hometown, it ended up being a what they call a Find Your Fate. It was a G.I. Joe Find Your Fate, and you could make your own character and stuff. So I remember that pretty vividly. But so I might have a voting scheme happen again for the Choose Your Own Adventure this time around. But I'm gonna have to go find some more Choose Your Own Adventures. They're not easy to find, and they're so beloved by people that it's not cheap either. So I'm a cheapskate. No, I don't know. When it comes to books, I really like to be frugal and find as much as I can for the least I can. But then I'll go buy a $30 steak. So I mean, who can say? Who can say? Here's a plug for you. Keep an eye out for the Midwest Horror Fest 2018 is coming up around Halloween time, and I'm judging that again, and I'll be putting my reviews in to try to sway the votes for those things. But definitely keep an eye out. There's a movie called Poltergeist, or not Poltergeist. Yeah, Poltergeist. Yeah, Poltergeist. Sorry, I thought I was saying Poultrygeist. You thought I said Poltergeist? So did I. I thought that I said Poultrygeist, but if you haven't seen Poltergeist, I mean, if you're looking for absolute balls out craziness with the most depraved shit thrown in that you can possibly think of, go ahead and watch Poltergeist, Night of the Living Chicken, or Chicken of the Living Dead. Night of the Chicken Dead. Night of the Chicken Dead. Poultrygeist, Night of the Chicken Dead. But that's not what I'm talking about right now. What I'm talking about is poultry. Damn it! This is that diabolical insect shit again. Poltergeist. It is. I got to see the short subject film of Poltergeist last year at the original inaugural Midwest Horror Fest, and it was a blast. It's basically if you took kind of like the Guy Ritchie British gangster films and you put a supernatural element in there that kind of like meshes with the comedy and some brutal scenes. But basically, it's about a a crew of British gangsters who end up having to go to a medium to try to channel their boss so they can find out where this money was buried. And the short, for as little, I mean, it may have been like 20, 30 minutes or whatever. It was great. And they've enhanced it. They've expanded it into a full feature film. So I'm curious to see how that comes out. But that will be playing. That's one of the first selections. It's not the first selection, but it's one of the first selections of the Midwest Horror Fest 2008. 18. I am tired, and I don't know what to tell you. what was that, bourbon barrel? I got some of this beer out of a bourbon barrel. I don't know what's happening to me, but yeah, definitely check out the Midwest Horror Fest page. They're out of Logansport. It's supported by HM&M Films, maker of Dolly Deadly, Night of the Dolls, Dolly Deadly 2, Kill Dolly Kill. They're totally rocking it out there. Tom and Rebecca and Tony and Dan, they're wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. So definitely go to the Midwest Horror Fest 2018 page. They did an Action Fest this year as well, and that was the inaugural Action Fest. So every year you'll be looking at 2 fests coming out of there, and they're great people, and movies coming from all over the world, and it's totally awesome. So definitely check them out. Was Don't Fuck there? Yeah, Don't Fuck in the Woods 1 was over there, but I'm trying to get... You're the one that convinced me to drink beer. I fought you for years about drinking beer. But anyway. Got any more plugs? Anything else coming out?
I'm actually going to have to take a hiatus probably in a week or 2 for Don't Fuck 2.
Andrew is taking a hiatus.
But I think it's not going to interfere with your show because we're going from Thursday to Thursday. So just
okay, yeah. So somehow he always takes a hiatus for other people, but somehow he always manages to find the time for my show. I don't know what that means. Does that mean anything? Does it mean anything? I'm not sure. But yeah. So am I seeing Juice? Juice is coming in at the very end. What are you gonna do?
Just like Juice, get the shout out.
The shout out, baby. But anyhow, this has been Diabolical Index. It is number 8, I believe, right? Number 8 of the regular entry, so that would make it the 15th overall, right? It's crazy.
You can math.
I can do that math. 7 plus 8, non-common core, represent. Yeah, I'm not. Don't even get me started on that. But but yeah. So Diabolical Index, number 8 or number 15, however you like to look at it. Coming back next Monday with most likely the Choose Your Own Adventure of your choice. Once I come up with a couple of picks, then you can vote on those. And like I said, not at the top, but probably at the middle, close to the end. If you have any suggestions, any picks, make sure to send them to me, either Magic Squirrel Network in the comments or the Diabolical Index at columnist.com. Facebook message, Instagram, whatever. Just get to me and throw it out there, and I'll see if I can mesh it together. So, June 4th, 2018, Diabolical Index. Keep it squirrely.